Welcome everyone to my YouTube channel, Video Chess Training. My name is International Master Will Paschall, and today I'm going to start a series I've entitled Taking Out the Tarrasch. The Tarrasch defense begins with the moves d4, d5, knight f3 or c4, followed by c5, c4, and e6, c takes d, and e takes d. If we go through a pure move order, we would normally go with d4, d5, c4, e6, knight c3, and c5. This is the kind of classic move order for the Tarrasch defense when black typically gets a structure resulting in what is typically going to become an isolated pawn on d5. Basically, I'm doing this series because it's a very, very popular defense for black. I encounter it all the time here on my stream on Lichess and playing in practice, of course. It's very common. It's also very difficult for black to play without making some kind of strategic mistakes, and I think that our chances against this defense are very good. There is a lot of classic games we can take a look at, but the man to really lead the instruction here is the late great Akiba Rubinstein, the wonderful almost world champion from Poland, one of the greatest players never to become world champion. Rubinstein was a master of playing the Tarrasch, actually for both sides. To be fair, Rubinstein also tried to play it with black. It was very popular in the early part of the 20th century. One of the most popular defenses to d4. So I thought we'd start out the first video of this series, basically part one of taking out the Tarrasch, with a game that Rubinstein played early in his career, a match against the master Salwe. This is played in Lodz 1908 in Poland. So Rubinstein is white, d4, d5, knight f3. Akiba liked to play a lot of closed queen-pawn games in addition to c4. He was actually very modern in his understanding of the opening, and he introduced many key ideas in just a plethora of different openings. The French defense bears his name, for example, in the Rubinstein variation, and the lines in the Queen's Gambit. But what was interesting about him with white was that he actually could play both main lines with c4 as well as kind of like positional closed queen pawn systems based on knight f3, e3, or knight f3, bishop f4, or bishop g5. So he was very universal in his ability to play different kind of setups. But against the Tarrasch, it was kind of his specialty. So here against the master Salwe, he plays after c5. By the way, very active way for black to play, kind of like a reverse Queen's Gambit. And after c5, Rubinstein played many games with d takes c5. This was another of his favorite lines, basically like a Queen's Gambit accepted reversed. But again, he was multi-talented, so he could play different stuff. And instead, he played the key move here, the sharpest move, which is c4. And like one final little tidbit of information from what I understand, in his later years when Rubinstein was confined to a hospital, he spent a long time apparently really seriously researching the variation c4, c5. This was became basically his obsession, this position with the symmetrical Tarrasch. So he was just fascinated throughout his life with the Tarrasch type of positions with both colors. A lot of pawn tension, very interesting. So d4, d5, knight f3, c5, and now he played c4. If white plays a quiet move like e3 or c3, I don't think he's challenging black. So this is definitely the most dynamic move. And black has different options here. He can play the Queen's Gambit accepted with d takes c4. He can play e6 going into the Tarrasch. Also, c takes d4 is a move. But e6 leads us to our Tarrasch. And now white plays c takes d and e takes d. So we have the starting position of a typical Tarrasch. I think it's advantageous for white to actually have delayed knight to c3, because in some variations, black plays interesting side variations with the move c4 and bishop to b4 sometimes. So I think by not playing knight to c3, white sort of sidesteps different kind of side variations. So here, for example, I would prefer g3 at this point for white. You know, from a pure standpoint, we see some games here in the opening explorer on Lichess Kramnik using this move order in particular. So it's really advantageous for white to delay knight c3. Instead, Rubinstein played knight to c3. This is perfectly okay as well. Now black with knight to f6. I think that technically knight c6 is the better and more accurate Tarrasch move. It makes sense developing the knight behind the pawns. If you want to play in a balanced way, we see way more games here with black playing knight to c6 than knight f6. But there isn't really a clear way to take advantage of knight f6. I mean, some people think that bishop g5 might be better than just transposing to the normal lines. That is possible, slightly different from the main lines. So knight f6, Rubinstein actually is credited with being like one of the inventors of g3. I'm not sure that's actually the case, but he certainly was one of the early players to popularize it. g3, knight to c6, bishop g2, and now c takes d. We're following again an early match game from Rubinstein against Salwe from 1908 in Poland. Now typically c takes d is not played here. This was played in the game that we're going to take a look at. It leads to a classic structure with the isolated queen pawn. But I figured while we're in the process of looking this game, we should just kind of take a look at what typically should happen here. So black shouldn't play c takes d right away. Black should play bishop to e7, and now white castles, and black castles. And there are different setups for white, depending on where you want to put your bishop. You can try to fianchetto on the queen side with b3, or play d takes c5, but the main line is bishop to g5, and now typically black will exchange on d4. There's another variation here with c4, leading to more closed type of positions. But the main line is c takes d4. When we get a structure similar to the game we're going to see here today, white takes back, and then there are two main lines for black. h6, kicking the bishop when it can go to either f4 or e3. Usually e3, you see, is vastly the main variation here. And bishop f4, a line I've played myself, which just leads to slight differences in the position. Bishop e3, of course, like keeping the very strong blockade of the isolated pawn on d5. And instead of h6, black can also play rook e8. This is kind of a move order finesse, and the experts with black can argue whether h6 or rook e8 is technically better. It's very hard to say. But another variation that would be typical to the game we're going to see today, I thought would be interesting, is queen b6. I knew a player who used to play this, putting pressure on b2 and putting pressure on d4. You see, not too many games here, because if white tries to win a pawn in this position with something like knight b3, bishop e6, and now bishop takes f6, it doesn't work out too well. Bishop takes f6, and then bishop takes d5 is no good for white. Bishop takes d5 looks like it wins a pawn, but it loses the initiative in the process. So turn on our stockfish here. I think rook a d8 was the move, and suddenly black's bishops are very active. All the black's pieces are very active, and we lost we lost the initiative here. Basically, we win a pawn, but we lose the initiative. Our king side is in trouble. A lot of weaknesses around the king side. Black has terrific strategic compensation. Maybe this knight will drop in here to e5, and f3 is weak. There's all sorts of problems for white. So trying to win a pawn and being greedy here is not good. In this position, we would just try to maintain the blockade. I think bishop e3, and white seems to have slightly better position. Queen d8, and some developing move like rook c1. I looked at this. This was my analysis. Queen d7, queen d3, making way for the other rook. So all of our pieces get to influence the center. And then rook fd8, rook fd1, rook ac8. This would be a typical game in the Tarrasch. Maybe black can try to play bishop h3, trading off our defender of our king side. But white has ideas of knight to c5, which will actually force black to surrender one of his bishops And I think that white remains with a small advantage after something like knight to c5, bishop takes c5, bishop takes c5. One has to admit that white has the slightly better structure, fairly active bishop pair, so white certainly doesn't stand worse, but black remains solid. I bring this up because, and why you might think why I bring up this queen b6, because in the game, if we go back to the game, we're going to see basically the same idea in this Rubinstein game from 1908, but the difference would be that in this game, Salwe plays queen b6 earlier in a much less accurate way. So we see g3, knight c6, bishop g2, and now c takes d right away, which is considered to be slightly inaccurate. And some strong players like Ponomarev have played this, I guess, for sort of surprise value. Queen b6, it's a very logical move. I mean, you're forcing white to make some sort of concession in this position. So we see Ponomarev, Fedoseev, some decent players who have actually, tried to play this for black. But again, who knows what the circumstances were. Maybe Ponomarev just wanted to surprise Ghimeshi, or maybe it was a rapid game, or who knows. There's many reasons, but be aware that Ponomarev probably, he knew that this is a side variation. So white here, now Rubinstein takes on c6, and that wouldn't be my first inclination, because we're kind of helping black fix his structure. The isolated pawn is a tangible weakness on d5. It's also a strength because it supports key squares in the center, c4 and e4, maybe outpost squares for black. But one has to admit, when I take on c6, as everyone has here, including Rubinstein, we're kind of correcting black's structure by giving him this slightly better structure, the hanging pawns, and the pawns protect each other to some extent. But the c6 pawn is still very backward and vulnerable. So a clear plan for white. Is there any other option here? Well, as we looked in the other game, I mean, knight to b3 would be an idea, but the problem is there's no time here. d4, and if we were castled, we could play bishop takes c6, chop the knight with check, and win the pawn on d4. We cannot do this now because bishop takes c6 check, queen takes c6, and our rook is hanging, and our knight is hanging on c3. So this is not an option for white to play knight b3 and hope to blockade the pawn. It isn't blockaded. Black actually gets a good game after d4. White would have to move the knight in some kind of embarrassing move like knight to e4, when it looks like it's probably about an equal position, honestly. But we failed to blockade the pawn at d5. So white could play e3, just kind of maintaining the square d4. But this creates some weaknesses in white's position, but more importantly, would block in our bishop. Blocking in our bishop at c1, I think, is a little bit of a concession. And arguably, like an expert positional player might be able to salvage some kind of small advantage here for white, but it's not easy to play with the bishop hemmed in at c1. So Rubinstein takes on c6, and now b takes c, and we transfer to this hanging pawn structure with the pawn at d5, pawn at c6. Now castles, and black plays bishop to e7. It's not really clear, as is the case in many openings, where the queen's bishop for black should go. I actually saw one game where black played bishop a6 very, very early. In fact, maybe in this position, yeah, right away. Or maybe the computer was analyzing this suggestion of bishop a6. It's interesting, but it's also a little bit artificial. It's possible we just get the rook to e1, and you end up in a situation where ultimately the bishop on a6 looks active, but it's actually absent from some important jobs like controlling this diagonal, for example. So a bit artificial. Black plays bishop e7. Kingside, black has to castle here. And now this is interesting, because if you go by the database, the Lichess Opening Explorer, you would say, oh wow, white's played e4 in a lot of games, and the engine's saying e4, so that must be the best move. I mean, it's possible that e4 is the best move in some sort of computer vacuum, but it has a major, major disadvantage, the move e4. I think that one set of pieces is already traded off the board, and if you want to win in this position with white, after e4, d takes e4, we see Ghimeshi did this, and he actually beat Ponomarev somehow, but knight takes e4, it looks to me, honestly, that white is allowing a lot of simplification here. So I would think there would be an awful lot of draws in this sort of position. Knight d5 is an interesting move for black. Not trading pieces and maintaining this knight on a really incredibly powerful outpost at d5. I think that's a spirited move and very interesting. White has a little advantage. You know, for example, maybe b3. That's next, putting the bishop on b2. And I think this is more pleasant for white. But objectively, probably black should trade pieces or allow an exchange. Castles and something like queen c2, bishop e3. But I think white's advantage is very small because a lot of pieces are being exchanged. At the end of the day, there just may not be enough pieces on the board, enough pawns on the board to win. Even if we win a pawn for white, it's going to be hard to win. So I think that it's better to play the way Rubinstein played, you know, not to play e4 in this position, but keep the pieces on the board. Here, he plays knight a4. And ironically, 15 modern games, the only player who played knight a4, none other than Predrag Nikolic, who was one of the best players in the world in the 90s. So I don't know. It's possible that Predrag actually knew the Rubinstein game, but it's also possible that he simply played this move, you know, on a natural positional judgment. But I like his decision not to trade pieces, you know, in playing for a win here. And we're playing a kind of improved version of that Tarrasch we looked at earlier. This bishop is going to go to e3, not to g5. White's actually saving time by not making this maneuver bishop g5. We're going to go to e3 in one go and control this key diagonal here. Some years later, Nimzowitsch would create his theories about what he called blockade, and I think that honestly, I mean, Rubinstein clearly understood the whole concept of blockade. You know, this is before anything that Nimzowitsch wrote about blockade, so you can obviously see it right here. I mean, this is blockade strategy. Queen b5 or queen a6, and this typical square in the Tarrasch for the queen. Black tries to stay as active as he can with the bad structure, but now bishop e3 kind of freezing these pawns, and the bishop can take up a very powerful post at d4, perhaps go to c5, perhaps allow knight c5. So it's not easy for black because black doesn't have any pawn breaks in this position. Castles, and then another piece, efficient development of the forces, very important principle. It's interesting that the computer thinks that white has just the most minute advantage here, the Stockfish engine, 0.1 for white. But perhaps if we let it run a little bit longer, the engine would start to appreciate white's long-term strategic advantage. But a very interesting thing happens now, bishop g4. And we transpose to one game from some lesser 2200s. f3. This looks like black is actually weakening, or forcing a weakening in white's position, and I think that's true. But what Rubinstein does here became a very classic sort of maneuver, and I've actually employed this in a relatively recent game when I was black in a Caro-Kann Panov against Ferenc Barabora, international master from Hungary a few years ago. Ironically, in pretty much the same kind of structure, I did the exact same maneuver that Rubinstein did in this game. It's a very classic maneuver. Even if I hadn't known the Rubinstein game, which I did, this idea of rook f2 and bishop f1, I mean, when you play f3, you're controlling key squares, g4, e4, taking away outpost squares for the enemy. And although this is slightly weakening white's kingside, white has 4 pawns, a really nice pawn chain to protect the king, and then the bishop can go to f1 and redeploy along this diagonal, and the rook can move laterally along the 7th rank. So bishop e6, this is a little passive. Maybe the bishop could go to d7, protecting the pawn, or f5 where it's more active. And now bishop c5, trading off black's good bishop, the one that defends the dark squares, leaving black with a bad bishop, leaving white coming back with bishop f1, ultimately bishop d3. White will have the better bishop in the end of the day, at the end of the day. So rook e8, rook f2. This game has been heralded for years by many top players, analyzed in books. So I'm not the first one to present it, but I thought that In a discussion of the Tarrasch, I mean, which I'm trying to do in this lecture series, this game is actually like a very important starting place. Rook f2, where we're going to come across laterally and probably put pressure along the c file, and bishop back to f1, getting that bishop active. The pawn to e3 is just a classic sort of pawn move in the hanging pawn positions in the Tarrasch. So black here tries to force white's hand, and he does get quite a few exchanges going on. I mean, 2 minor pieces are off the board, and it seems like white's advantage is very tiny. But white's understanding of placement of the pieces is excellent here. I mean, he could have played e3, I guess, in this position, but black would have c5. So this is like a model game. Queen d4. Look how this queen protects b2. It protects the knight on c5. It guards the c5 square that we're trying to blockade. And it also even guards e3. Before we've even played e3, Rubinstein sort of overprotecting that square, so it's not hanging when white plays e3. Rook e8. I don't know what to recommend for black here. It's kind of an unpleasant position, but he's tied down to the a7 pawn as well. There's actually another benefit of the centralized queen on d4. It's actually hitting a7, so black can't really move the a rook without worrying about losing that pawn as well. Rook e8, and now bishop f1. This, I guess, gives him options, to play possibly e4. I mean, structurally, that's not necessarily what white, is intending here. But this is kind of a little bit more aggressive than playing e3 directly. Black is fearless, plays rook c8, and now e3. The queen must go back. Typical retreat, by the way, in these lines. I've played a lot of blitz games against some strong players. In the Tarrasch, some specialists. One that comes to mind is the Azeri Grandmaster Elmar Magaramov, who I've played countless blitz games with over the years on the internet. Certain players play the Tarrasch their whole career, and they're just really expert in it, And I remember many times he would have the queen on b5, drop back to b7. We had positions like this a million times. Queen b7, and now knight c5. And what's interesting is Rubinstein doesn't mind exchanging here. He's actually a specialist in endgames. He was extremely strong in technique and technical positions, rook endgames. Some people consider him to be like one of the greatest rook endgame players, probably, in the history of chess. So knight to c5, he has no problems trading pieces here. And you need to have confidence in your technique in the endgame. Rook takes c5, and so white's not playing for direct attack. He's playing to maintain a strategic advantage and grind it out, basically. If we can break through and maybe win this pawn on c6, maybe win the pawn on a7, because essentially that's a weakness too. And that's actually the case here, what happens here. Black plays rook c7, and now rook doubling, and queen b6, and b4, fixing the pawn on c6. This is a blockade strategy before Nimzovich even created my system. So this move, I don't know. We would like to not play a6, but I think that the handwriting's already on the wall here. Black is facing b5 and probably tripling of the heavy pieces. There may simply be no defense. So putting the pawn on a6, though, is like a secondary weakness. This becomes a secondary weakness on a6, and that leads us to the principle of two weaknesses, where oftentimes one can defend passively one weak point, but when it becomes 2 weak points, the opponent can just endlessly torture us by alternating with threats back and forth against the two weaknesses. And once the pawn goes to a6, it becomes kind of like a concrete target on the white square. So I think at this point after a6, it's pretty clear that black is close to strategically lost. We have rook a5, and white would not mind trading queens. One of these pawns is almost certainly going to fall, and the trade of queens, the fact that white's pawn on d4 would be isolated, would be virtually irrelevant because the pawn is just impossible to lay siege to. So rook b8, and then a3, and then rook a7. Black has to passively defend the pawn a7, and here he just fell victim to a tactic. But basically this position is just indefensible for black. I mean, there is no way for black to protect, I don't think, all of the material here. So something's got to fall, and he blunders simply the shot rook takes c6 in this position, and it's over. Game over. I mean, materially decisive. So I think it's possible there was another tactic here if we go back a moment. Actually, yeah, it looks like he could have played rook takes d5 here in some moment. Maybe rook takes d5 in this position. Let me check with the engine. Right, yeah, this was possible. Maybe he wasn't 100% certain about this ending after c takes d5, queen takes b6. It's a little bit messy. C takes d5, queen takes b6, rook takes c2. Yeah, I don't think this is clear by any stretch of the imagination. So Rubinstein definitely did the right thing, not cashing in for that attempt immediately. No, he kept the pressure on, rook a5, and now the best would have been something like queen b7, trying to defend. But I really don't think that black's going to hold on here, you know, long term. So eventually something will fall. But this would have maintained the defense for the time being. White would build up, try to create pressure on those two weaknesses, maybe even try to gain space on the king side and create a chance over there. But it looks like for the most part White's focusing on the queen side here. So serious blunder for black, unfortunately, with not rook b8, but the next move, a3, rook a7 here. So instead of rook a7, queen b7, maybe there's no defense here, objectively. The computer doesn't see a defense. I don't see a defense in this position either. I don't think there's any way to save this. He plays rook a7, blunders the shot, and it's over. A matter of technique, but White has everything under control. e3 is protected, a6 is falling. It's very hard for black to actually attack White with the bishop and the dark squared pawns and the king. It's looking like it's just not possible. And plus black cannot get control of the c-file. White's going to maintain control of the c-file. Basically everything in the white position is protected except for the pawn on f3. And now black's rook is hanging on b8, so there's just no counterplay. And he just avoids any sort of counterplay with this cutting off the c-file, and it's basically a matter of technique now. Queen b7. Interesting move, king f2. You know, this is something to defend f3. And it's also about centralizing the king for the endgame. But if you don't know this principle, every time we start to get closer and closer to the endgame, as we start to get closer to the endgame, king centralization becomes very important. And here in a position, you know, where most people would probably play, I don't know, he saw the threat of d4. You know, he didn't want to allow black counterplay with queen takes f3. So it's actually kind of a ghost threat. You know, perhaps like d4, queen takes d4 would probably be good. He's just careful, and plus in the endgame the king might be better placed. h5, and now bishop e2. Here I think maybe black should have tried h4. Maybe Rubinstein most likely would have just ignored it. But after g6 he quickly starts to look for the white squares, the dark squares in the position. I would think, you know, that I would go for h4 if I were white here. I'm not sure why he hesitated with that. He only played it a few moves later. Rook c5, queen b7, now h4. But I think that black had one moment where he could have perhaps here just a moment ago tried h4. Let's see what the computer thinks. I mean, this to me looks like a better practical try than anything else in this position. Yeah, according to the engine, we should just ignore it, which is probably the best advice. So g6, queen d6, queen c8, rook c5, and black is just suffering here. h4, a5, a desperate attempt to break out, and black is not allowed to have even an open file. So very important when you're winning, just allow zero counterplay. Rook c7, driving him back, and then b5, just smothering all the counterplay. Nothing for black here. a4, b6, rook a5, and then b7. And then white is threatening rook to c8 check here, basically winning everything. There is no defense to rook c8 check. I would think your first instinct would be to move the king up, but then you lose the king to a lateral check. Rook takes f7. So there's no defense for black here. This is just a model game against the Tarrasch from Rubinstein, one of dozens of games he played, and we will actually encounter more in a series I'm going to continue over time here, taking out the Tarrasch. This was Rubinstein-Salwe from the match 1908 loads. This was part 1 of taking out the Tarrasch. Thanks for joining me here at my YouTube channel. I'm International Master Will Paschall, and I'm often streaming. So don't forget to like and subscribe here at YouTube. Check out my live streams, and thanks for tuning in, guys. Have a great day. Bye-bye.